My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I'm getting mighty tired of Ren and Stimpy. There's been some interesting stuff so far. Stimpy's Invention was a really good game, but covering so many games from the same show gets fatiguing. I felt this a bit with the Adventure Time games in Cartoon Network video game history, but at least those games experimented with different genres. The real fatigue has come from the fact that every Ren and Stimpy game so far has essentially been the exact same thing. And this won't just stop with Ren and Stimpy, the Rocko's Modern Life and Real Monsters games are the same thing too. Nevertheless, I'm back this week to cover Ren and Stimpy Buckaroos. Buckaroos is unique in that it was released for both the NES and SNES, and each version was slightly different. Now, they're not completely different games, like we'll see quite a bit of later on in Nickelodeon video game history, but they're unique enough to warrant coverage of both ports. Also, fun fact, while most listings for this game, most YouTube videos, and YouTube's own suggestions act as if Buckaroos is spelt with an A before the R, it's actually not true. As you can see on the box art, it's spelled with an E. However, I'm sure I'll be fucked over by the algorithm if I do use the correct spelling in the title, so for the sake of that, I'll stick to being wrong like everyone else. Apparently the NES version was released in December of 1993, while the SNES version came out far later in 1995. I've basically given up on trying to verify these release dates though. There's a million different listings wherever you look. Heck, the Ren and Stimpy wiki says this came out in April of 1993. Strangely enough, despite already reviewing a handful of Ren and Stimpy games, this is the first on the NES, and our first NES game since Double Dare. It's also the fourth and final Ren and Stimpy game to be released in 1993. What a year to be a Ren and Stimpy fan, as long as you had 4 different consoles. The release for Buckaroos just feels so weird to me. Releasing a title for the NES in 1993 feels a bit bizarre, but it isn't unheard of. But the fact that they revisited this game 2 years later and majorly tweaked it for the SNES is much more surprising. Both versions of the game were developed by Imagineering, who developed Space Cadet Adventures, the first Ren and Stimpy game. Critically, it seems like there was a mixed reception to Buckaroos and it performed worse than the games we've already played. The aggregate score on Game Rankings was a 57, but the surviving reviews listed on Moby Games range from a 60 to a 78. So let's jump in and see for ourselves in this review doubleheader. Naturally, we're kickstarting things with the NES version. Here's another Ren and Stimpy game, and what do you know? Stimpy is creating an invention for roughly the 600th time. Back to the lab again. This time the story, as if these games even needed one, sees Stimpy creating a video game system that has them play through old adventures. Whenever they complete a level, they get money. Considering how desperate Microsoft have been to win back players for next gen, they're honestly only like a few steps away from implementing a similar mechanic in the Xbox. You get a cutscene to explain this very brief story stuff. Well, as much as you can call anything on the NES a cutscene. Ren looks like a bootleg ass Yoda here. It's a Cristiano Ronaldo statue level of terrible likeness. Before actually getting into the game, you're able to mess around with your button configurations. I just stuck with the default. For me, A made the characters jump, while pressing B is the attack button, or if you hold it while moving, it'll make you run. Once again, you'll play as both Ren and Stimpy, with Stimpy's hairball attack and Ren's useless karate chop back for the millionth time. Where things slightly differ from Ren and Stimpy games in the past is that you can switch characters on the fly, but only in certain places. Occasionally, you'll come across these wanted posters that have the face of the character you're not currently using. Grabbing these instantly switches characters, and generally the character you change to will have a full health bar, so it kind of acts like a health boost. That's just about where the positives end for Buckaroos on the NES. The first major issue you'll notice when dropped into the game is that your health bar isn't fully filled. Why? Why did they feel it necessary to do this? What is the point other than to punish players? It gets worse once you start trying to move Ren or Stimpy around though. Movement is unbelievably slow, even when you're holding down the run button. The best way to describe the feeling is that it seems like Ren and Stimpy are constantly trudging through mud. It's supremely unsatisfying to control. Further adding to this movement issue is that you can't run and jump. It's one of the most basic things in a 2D platformer, yet it's absent here and makes the whole game clunky as hell. I'd say Buckaroos for the NES is the worst controlling Nickelodeon game so far. It feels like you're actively fighting against the game every time you need to do a basic movement. Before you really get to experience the platforming though, you're thrown into a few really weird sequences. So the first level you play is based on Space Madness, yet again, but it's a weird escort mission where you have to guide Ren. This is a jarring way to kick off a game that is primarily a platformer. It really caught me off guard. Ignoring that fundamentally this is a bad way to introduce players into the game, forcing players to try and learn all of the movement controls while also tasking them with throwing items around to keep Ren safe and moving in the right direction is just too much. It's especially bad considering you don't do anything like this ever again. If that wasn't bad enough, roughly 30 seconds into the level you're thrown into a shmup section. Imagineering are throwing all these random things at the wall in just the opening minutes. To make matters worse, this section has a god-awful frame rate. Things literally start to crawl just because they dump a billion enemies on screen and the poor little NES can't handle it. Just what the fuck, guys? Was it too much to ask for a simple introductory level that teaches you the basics? Why opt for a first level that has you doing a bunch of things irrelevant to the other 75% of the game? Once you finally move on, you'll find that Imagineering have brought over one of the worst aspects of Space Cadet Adventures. If you watch that review, you'll know that one of my big complaints was how hard it was to tell what was a platform. Well, the same thing applies here. Good luck discerning what you can land on half the time. And then we've got the combat. If you do decide to play this game, and I'm really struggling to think of any reason why you would do that, don't use Ren. Just don't do it. Ren's melee attack is just completely useless. It feels like the entire game is designed around Stimpy's ranged attack. And that's because it kind of is. See how you're running around and you're picking up a whole assortment of random things? Well, those are actually weapons. Almost all of the things you pick up can be used as projectiles, and this does apply to Ren. However, they're in such limited supply that you're still completely fucked if you're playing as Ren. It's also pretty silly that the developers expect players to just know that the random socks you see laying around levels can be used as weapons. Literally nothing points to this being the case. So yeah, it seems like picking Ren is pretty unfair because the game is designed around projectiles and Ren only has limited use of them. What's even more staggering is how nerfed Ren's regular attack is compared to Stimpy's. I'm not joking when I say some enemies take 3 times as many hits to kill with Ren's attack compared to Stimpy. Was this necessary? The game was already designed around Stimpy and then they go and do this. What were they thinking? This might as well be just a Stimpy game considering how much they catered towards him. Graphically, I thought it was pretty solid for the NES. Obviously no game from this era is going to look stunning, but this seems like the best you can do to recreate the look and feel of the show on such limited hardware. And that's my experience with Buckaroos on the NES. Yes, this section is pretty short because I called it quits 3 levels in. I hated every second of this and nothing was going to drastically change that. The game is also only 30 minutes long if you're particularly good at it, so there's barely any content. It's just a god-awful game. It's not fun to play, and the developers honestly seem to be deliberately trying to design the worst game possible. From the terrible way they introduce you to the mechanics, forcing you through 2 types of sections that never appear again up front, to the way they have clearly built this game around one specific character, it's hard to believe a company was proud enough to slap their name on this. There have been other Nick games so far that have been more frustrating, but this is by far the worst Nickelodeon game yet. On to the SNES, I guess. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the SNES version is different enough to warrant a review, but has clearly been built on the back of the NES version. This can be seen with the game's intro cutscenes and story, which mirror the NES game, but in way higher detail and quality. Mechanically, the game is also afforded a few new things thanks to the upgrade in console generations. Specifically, the SNES featuring more buttons allows run to be assigned to a separate button than your attack, making it feel a whole lot smoother. Ren and Stimpy don't feel like they're stuck in mud anymore, and you can run and jump now, making the platforming a whole lot better. You've also got a bunch of projectile weapons that you can use like the last game. Luckily, we already know about this, but the game has an inventory in the top right corner at all times now, making it a little more obvious. So we're already seeing a bunch of positives, but unfortunately, that's basically where it ends again. While the NES version of Buckaroos was just fundamentally bad on a control and design level, it's mostly the little things that make its SNES brother a bad time. For example, each level is prefaced with a long-ass text-scrolling section that sets up the backstory of the level. This takes way too long, is insanely boring, and is basically the antithesis of what Ren and Stimpy is all about. When you do get into the game, you'll discover that Buckaroos on the SNES has recreated basically every level in the original, but has obviously expanded on them and tweaked a lot of things. In addition to those remade levels, there's also a bunch more content. There are 12 levels in total for you to fight through. On the surface, it seems like you've got a heap of variety at your fingertips, but instead, each of the 12 levels falls into one of 3 categories. Levels are either medieval, space, or western themed. Personally, this felt pretty lame to me. They had the chance to bring 12 Ren and Stimpy episodes to life, but instead chose to rehash the same 3 over and over again. Yet again, the game starts you off in levels and respawns you after deaths with less than full health. I'm honestly just lost for words at this point. Like I said, it's a lot of little things that bring this one down. Basic stuff like not easily being able to grab onto and climb up these vines hurt the experience. Or what about the fact that your own damn projectiles will damage you? I think the one sort of highlight is level 2. Here you're still doing the traditional platforming gameplay, but you're riding a chicken and purely using a bow and arrow. There's still so many awful things about it, but this level was the closest I came to enjoying myself with Buckaroos. The gameplay almost finds a good rhythm. But then you're hit with the staggeringly dumb design and it brings you back to reality. It's even all over this level. You're constantly being told to take leaps of faith with no idea what's coming and no chance to react. And like a true, typical shitty platformer, there are plenty of moments where so much crap is flying across the screen and you have no chance to react to it. Just look at how many enemies they send at you during the final cowboy level. It's unrelenting. I also want to give a special shout out to the Space Madness levels. These are exactly the same as the very first level on the NES, where you're guiding Ren to the end of the level. I'll give them props for not having this be a one-off thing here, and you don't get a random out of place shmup section either. They still absolutely suck though, and are easily the worst parts of the game. The core gameplay loop here is that you're constantly needing to scroll through your inventory to find items that will keep Ren moving forward and out of trouble. It's so clunky to constantly be scrolling through a limited inventory view with the left and right bumpers, and on top of that, it's often not very clear what you're supposed to do and where you're supposed to go with Ren. Graphically, I'd give the game a tick, and I like the way Ren and Stimpy look. However, I think the environments are just off. For a random, non-licensed game, yeah, they look rather pretty, but for a game based on this show, they feel ill-fitting. For a Ren and Stimpy game, it doesn't feel right. It's like our heroes have been dropped into a completely different world. To top it all off, the music is dreadful thanks to featuring the world's shortest loops. The SNES is capable of producing intricate, banger soundtracks, yet we're constantly getting stuck with 15-second loops of the most repetitive songs ever written. Both the NES and SNES versions of Buckaroos are awful. There are literally no reasons for you to ever experience these games. The NES game is completely irredeemable, and while there are sections of the SNES that are not good but bearable I guess, it's still not worth the hassle. I suppose if you really wanted to experience Buckaroos, boot up the SNES version and input the level select code for level 2. Outside of that, it's pretty dire. I'm honestly reaching the end of my rope for Ren and Stimpy and their shitty games. There's still 2 more to come, and even the Rocko's Modern Life and Real Monsters games don't look like they're going to be any different in style. Rugrats cannot get here quick enough. I'll take a shitty 3D game over the never-ending onslaught of godforsaken 2D platformers any day. Next time I'll be reviewing Rocko's Modern Life, Spunky's Dangerous Day. While it's yet another 2D side-scrolling platformer, could it buck the trend that Ren and Stimpy have been setting? Make sure you subscribe to find out.